all day. Thank you.
With that, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today. Karen Wagner comes from Wichita. She is the presenter for her mom. Her mom made the quilts that she's going to talk about. Her mom is what, 87. And 2 years ago, I think it was, I actually heard her mom give this presentation. It was so exciting. And so I'm going to turn it over to to Karen to share with you on our Civil War quilts. And if we think about the birthday of Kansas, basically Kansas was born in the Civil War.
Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, thank you. Good afternoon. I want you to just take a minute and look, and this will become more evident as we turn each of these quilts. But imagine how many families are represented by these quilts, and how many hours it took to make all of these quilts. And today we're going to carry on the legacy of each one of these quilts. It's really an honor to be here today and to share the history and the legacy that's being passed down by our mom, Jo Hodge, and our dad, of course. Mom is the artist and the visionary behind the quilts, but my dad, to my knowledge, has never griped about a single dime she spent at the quilt store. And so I need to mention that today. That's probably because he has a passion for golf, and I think he might have equaled what she spent. But Mom and Dad have been married for 65 years and produced 3 wonderful children. My sister Nancy is from Olsberg. She's here with us today. My brother Russ has lived his entire adult life in Heidelberg, Germany. And my husband and I live in Wichita, and Doug is doing the PowerPoint for us today. Mom and Dad raised us to be history buffs. And give me an antique store or a museum and I can be happy for hours. I've always wanted my home to look like my grandmother's home, not like my daughter's beautiful HGTV home. And as a musician like Mom, I love the folk songs and the oral history of the music that's being passed down to us, and especially the African American spirituals of the Civil War. I'm going to raise this up just a little bit. When Debbie asked Mom to come today, Mom was so excited to share this wonderful story again of the Civil War quilts. But she will be 87 in April, and thankfully her mind is incredible. She remembers everything, which is a blessing and a curse at the same time. But her mobility isn't great today, and Nancy's daughter is getting married in March, and so we need to make a long trip to that, and Mom just wasn't sure she was up to both trips. So she asked me if I would do this today, and I am honored to do so. We'll use a lot of her words today, and even though she isn't here physically, she is definitely here in spirit. I am not the expert on this topic, she is, and so forgive any mistakes that I might make. I have a lot of her notes, and she has her paper on the quilt order number 11 and the historical aspects of that. Over here on the table, I've got a few copies. Debbie can make more, but if you would like, they're over there. Mom was always fascinated by the Civil War. She grew up in Missouri, right on the border, and in Missouri, each student was required to take Missouri history in order to graduate. Then she went to college at KU, and she studied Kansas history. So the Kansas-Missouri border wars of the Civil War were not only fascinating to her, they were personal. And we'll get into that in a few minutes. So you take this history buff, who becomes a master quilter, plus the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and the rest is history. The quilts in this collection each represent a specific snapshot from the Civil War. Mom made one for each year of the war, and one depicting the reconstruction that took place following the war's end. These are not necessarily old patterns, but the originators named them to represent significant events that took place from 1861 to 1866. The fabrics used in each quilt are nearly exact reproductions of the fabrics available to the quilters in the Civil War. And I'm sure many of you have used a lot of these fabrics many times. It was really interesting to me to learn that the reason we have such really good, accurate reproductions is that they discovered the fabric salesman's sample books from the mid-1800s, and that allowed people to duplicate those fabrics with very, very authentic colors and patterns. Mom made several of these from quilts, but none of the quilts were pre-cut, so she had to do all of that, of course. Those kits are listed in your handout that you got at the registration table. And she wanted you to know that each of those quilts gave her ample fabric. You know, sometimes those kits can be, sometimes they can be a little bit skimpy with the fabric, but these gave her plenty of fabric to make the quilts in the patterns. And from those scraps, from those kits, she had enough leftovers to make quilt number 6, quilt number 7, 8, 9, 10, and I've seen her stash of scraps, and I will inherit that someday, yay. But she'd better start figuring out the next set of quilts because she's got enough scraps to do that. I needed a handwork project, so I'm borrowing some of her scraps to make a yo-yo Civil War quilt. Mom began quilting in earnest when she retired 30 years ago. She began by hand piecing and hand quilting everything. Soon she realized she had too many ideas and wasn't going to get as many quilts done as she would like. So she learned how to machine piece, and she is amazing at it. To this very day, she gets really excited when she discovers new quilt patterns and methods of piecing. She's also the most frugal person I have ever met in my whole life. She laughed at this sentence. She'll freeze a half a can of generic cream of chicken soup because she's going to use it later. But she'll pop out that credit card when she walks into a quilt store without any problem. Another thing that helped Mom's obsession with quilts was that years ago, she met a true quilting artist named Barbara Stevens, who lived just a few miles from them in the Ozarks. Barbara specializes in long arm machine quilting, and they've had a friendship for over 20 years. All of the quilts in this collection were quilted by Barbara, and today I've brought along 2 of my favorites that Mom made for me and Barbara quilted, and they're here on this table. They're not a part of the collection, but the quilting is magnificent, so pick them up, look at them, it's fabulous. The quilts actually made during the Civil War had a specific purpose: to keep husbands and fathers and sons of the quilters warm. The women in the North were fairly used to making quilts to keep their families warm through the winter months, and you can see Mom's picture on the wall with her quilts around her. From what history tells us, the wealthy women of the South had primarily made quilts for artistic purposes. They weren't needed for the warmth. Their slaves had made the quilts that were actually used, and probably made some of those artistic quilts as well. In the war, the Union soldiers were well equipped at the beginning of the war, but everybody thought the war would only last 6 months instead of 5 years. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The Southern soldiers were a different story. There was no central supply, and even uniforms were really hard to come by. The officers even had trouble getting the light blue uniforms of the Confederate Army. Many Southern men fought in the clothes that they wore when they signed up, and they certainly weren't used to the frigid temperatures they encountered during the early battles that were fought mainly in the North. They had a great need of quilts to keep them warm. It was tough during the Civil War for the women of the South to even produce quilts, and some cut up their carpets to make blankets for the soldiers. Before the war, cotton had been raised in the South, so they had plenty of cotton. But they sent that cotton north to be spun and woven into fabric, and then they shipped the fabric back to the South. Some was even imported from Europe for them. But during the war, the North blocked all those ports. It shut down the railways, and there wasn't any way to get that fabric from the North to the South. So they had plenty of cotton, but they didn't have fabric. So they had to suddenly learn how to spin and to weave, and both of those are very time-consuming, especially if you're not used to doing them. One of the common fabrics that they wove is called linsey. And you can see some examples that are really close to linsey and actually may be linsey in the utility quilt here. This was a coarse, rough fabric made from cotton and wool woven together. Their dresses were made out of them, the uniforms were made out of them, everything. Underwear was made out of them. We also see a lot of old clothing pieces in those quilts of the South. Artistic quilts were put on hold, and utility quilts like this one became a necessity. Quilts were needed for the wounded. They were vital to keeping the soldiers warm and alive during the cold winters. Women wrapped their valuables in the quilts to hide them from raiding armies. And of course, they used them to comfort and protect their children. The Civil War quilts hold a fascinating and special place in this period of our history. So we're going to go through each of the quilts that represent a year of the war, and we'll talk about that quilt. And if you're a time watcher like me, don't freak out, because we're going to spend a lot more time on the first quilt than the rest of them. So relax. The quilt behind me is titled Order Number 11. And this is the quilt that started it all for Mom. It represents 1861, and she made it 150 years later in 2011. As we know, the formal date for the Civil War is usually 1861. But living in this part of the country, you know that a war was going on at the western border of Missouri, eastern border of Kansas, for at least 7 years before that date. Because of the Missouri Compromise, Missouri was allowed to enter into the Union as a slave state in 1821. It was part of the Union, but it was a slave state. In the early 1850s, the Kansas-Nebraska Act negated the Missouri Compromise by allowing Kansas and Nebraska to enter the Union, but they got to vote on whether they were going to be a slave state or a free state. And that election is crazy fascinating. So if you're interested in that stuff, you might look it up, because I didn't know Kansas was a slave state for a while. Did you? Okay. Well, you know Lecompton. And so, yeah, it's cool. Although Missouri never seceded from the Union, the presence of so many slave owners forced the Union officials to try to keep a tight rein on the population of the state. You can see how our country was split at that time. Missourians were not happy with the activities of the abolitionists, oh, that was a bad slip, who headquartered in Lawrence. And the extreme laws were passed on both sides of that border. Raids became more and more frequent as William Clark Quantrill and his band of bushwhackers from Missouri plundered farms and cities on the Kansas side, only to see retaliation from Jim Blaine and his band of Jayhawkers as they destroyed Missouri homesteads. The term bleeding Kansas was absolutely true, but Missouri was bleeding too. In early August of 1863, the Union Army General for Missouri issued General Order Number 10, imprisoning anyone in the border districts of Missouri who was found to have willingly aided Quantrill and his men. Because of that order, several women were arrested, including wives of some of the bushwhackers. On August 13th, the prison in Kansas City in which they were kept collapsed and killed 5 of those women. Quantrill was enraged, and 1 week later, at daybreak on August 20th, he and his men entered Lawrence. You probably know the story. 4 hours later, approximately 150 men were dead, and the town was almost totally destroyed. 3 days after that, General Ewing issued General Order Number 11. And this is where the story becomes part of our family history. You have a copy of that order in your handout so you can read the entire edict. But to summarize, the Union decreed that 3 entire counties and part of a 4th that make up the Missouri side of the Kansas-Missouri border be emptied of all of their residents. And you can see on the map, the river is at the top. This is the eastern border of Missouri on the right and Kansas on the left. If the people, they had 15 days to leave that part, those counties. If they could prove allegiance to the Union, they could go to one of the military outposts. They still had to leave. So imagine somebody saying, okay, you have to leave, but you have to get to Fort Riley in 15 days. On foot, no horses, it's you and your children. If they didn't leave the area, often they were killed or imprisoned. And most of those fleeing were women and children, as the men had gone to war or had joined one of the outlaw gangs. The major cities were exempt from that order and the little area around those cities. Any structures that remained in those 3.5 counties were to be burned or confiscated. All the homes, all the businesses, everything. This was supposed to prevent anyone from aiding Quantrill and his men, but they were smart men, and they knew the territory way better than the Union men who had come from the east, and they were able to escape. It is estimated that on August 25th, when Order Number 11 was issued, the population of Cass County alone, and you can see it's, you have Jackson County at the top, Cass County in the middle, Bates County down, and then Vernon County. Cass County, the population on August 25th was about 20,000 people. 15 days later, it was 600 people. So 19,000 women and children evacuated that area in 15 days. On the map in front of you, you see the area included in Order Number 11 and the important locations during that time. And this is where our story gets personal. You can see in red about halfway up the little town of Amsterdam, Missouri in Bates County, population 233 when I was growing up. So this is where my mom was born and raised, and my grandparents, E.J. and Mabel Evans, lived there until 1990. My grandfather's farm was in the evacuated area. Growing up, we spent much of our time in these counties, not knowing the bloody history we were standing upon. But my mom knew, though. She was well aware of what was under her feet. When they tore up the dining room floor of my grandparents' house to put central heating in, they discovered the ruins of a burnt-out cabin destroyed during Order Number 11. As a child, Mom spent a lot of time with an elderly lady they called Grandma Braden. Grandma Braden told stories of the hardships that she suffered and her family suffered during the border war. She had vivid memories of her father returning from somewhere and hiding under the boards of their cabin floor. The children in the family were warned never to talk to anyone about where their father was. Mom realizes that she never asked whether Mr. Braden was sympathetic to the north or to the south. Had he been on a raid in Kansas with the bushwhackers, or was he hiding from them? We'll never know. My dad, Ed Hodge, was born in North Kansas City, very near the Snai Wilderness, and you can see Snai W. We didn't have room for the word wilderness up at the top. This was where the main hideout for Quantrill was located. And then my dad grew up in Aubrey, Kansas. You can see that one. And that was a famous escape route for Quantrill and his men in that area. Our grandparents and many other family members are buried in cemeteries that lie within just a few miles of that border. Now for the cool history of the quilt. The pattern for the quilt is the hickory leaf pattern, or the reel. But its story is this. Fanny Krieger, a 10-year-old girl, saw her mother's beautiful new quilt snatched from their bed by marauders in 1863 when they were forced to leave their home to comply with order number 11. She carried that design in her mind for years and later reproduced the quilt, christening it order number 11. Fanny Krieger grew up and married George Washington Haller, who'd been a member of Quantrill's bushwhacker troops. I think that's quite something. And this quilt pattern was printed in the Kansas City Star in 1929. So Mom knew she had to make this quilt. She also created single squares of the design for each of us kids, mine is over on the table over there, to use as wall quilts, so that we could carry forth the history of the land that she grew up on. She did modify the pattern just a bit, and it's amazing because all the historic patterns of this are slightly different. But she had trouble getting the little points to cleanly line up with the applique. So she modified it and curved them just a bit. Her fabric choices were somewhat limited because reproduction fabrics weren't as prevalent in 2011 at the start of the anniversary as they were later. And now they're much easier to find. And she says that the Kansas Troubles line of fabrics is one of her absolute favorites. And I wonder why. Okay, quilt number 2 is this one over here. And it's the Civil War battle hymn from 1862. Mom made it in 2012. Mom has been a phenomenal musician her entire life, and we've all carried on that gift. It's really appropriate for this quilt to be a part of her collection. It commemorates the anthem written in 1862 by Julia Ward Howe, and we still sing it today. Mine eyes have seen the glory of, you know the song. A copy of that is in your handout. This slide is the original title page and then the poem from 1862. Julia Ward Howe was born in 1819, was a poet and writer, the mother of 6 children, and worked tirelessly for the cause of humanity. As an adult during the war, she was part of the United States Sanitary Commission, which promoted clean and hygienic conditions for soldiers and hospitals. They made and gathered clothes and quilts and bandages and supplies for the soldiers. After the war, Julia supported the 15th Amendment, which gave voting rights to African American males, and then worked diligently for the suffrage movement to extend those rights to females. 1862 was the first full year of the war, with many battles and losses. The quilts of this time were primarily made of pieces of men's clothing, small florals on a repeat pattern, seed bags, and sometimes old uniforms from soldiers who had died were sewn into the quilt. Because the quilts were made by women left behind to run the home, raise the children, keep the businesses afloat, and finish as many quilts as possible, simple blocks were used, and quite often, they didn't use any batting. And again, you can see a sample of the utility quilts here. The fabrics in this quilt represent those fabrics available during the first year of the Civil War. They are nearly exact reproductions of patterns and colors because of those sample books they had found. The battle hymn quilt was machine pieced from a Hancock's of Paducah, Kentucky quilt. The quilt design is by Barbara Breckman. I'm sure you know who Barbara Breckman is. She lives in Lawrence, and she's one of the leading quilt historians and designers of our day. And now we're going to do quilt number 3. And Nancy's going to turn it for us. This is called Chickamauga. Have any of you heard of Chickamauga? Okay, a few. It was a new thing for me. It represents 1863. Mom made it in 2013. This quilt commemorates a battle fought from September 18th through 20th, 1863, in southeastern Tennessee and the far northwest corner of Georgia. You can see it on your map. Just a few miles south of Chattanooga. It's the smallest quilt in the collection, made primarily as a wall quilt or a throw. Chickamauga is the name of the creek that runs along the south side of the battlefield, upon which the first major battle in Georgia took place. And you realize how many battles there were until the end of the war in Georgia. Though the specific battle was short, sadly, more casualties resulted from this series of battles than from any other except for Gettysburg. It is recorded in history as the first significant Union loss, and even though the Confederates were technically declared the victors, they didn't achieve their objective of destroying the Union Army or restoring Confederate control to this part of the country. And the Confederate Army suffered losses that it could ill afford. 2 months later, by the end of November, Union General Ulysses Grant broke the Confederate grip on Chattanooga and opened the gateway to the Deep South for Sherman's Army campaign. The Chickamauga quilt is machine-pieced from a fabric kit of reproduction fabrics from Hancock's of Paducah. Next one. Yeah. She reminded me it's the first sentence on my paper, too. This is Mom's favorite quilt in the series. This is Leesburg Inn, and it represents 1864, and she made it in 2014. Leesburg, Virginia is located just 2 miles south of the Potomac River, which was the border between the state of Maryland, which is in the Union, and the state of Virginia, which was in the Confederacy. And it's just a few miles from Washington, D.C. In 1862, Virginia had seceded from the Union, but had not yet joined the Confederacy. Many Virginians owned slaves, but they typically weren't field workers like you find in the rural areas. Leesburg's slaves were often skilled artisans, or they worked in various shops or in the homes of their owners, but they were slaves nonetheless. By the war's end, Leesburg had changed hands more than 150 times, back and forth. Many of those battles are well documented, including the Battle of Ball's Bluff. If you're into all that detail, the internet has some great information on all those battles and some really good historical pictures as well. This pattern is actually from an inn in Leesburg in the 1880s, but history shows there were several inns in the city during the war. Mom saw a picture of this quilt in a magazine and fell in love with it, and was able to find almost the exact fabrics in the picture. Some from the Bittersweet Quilt Shop outside Joplin, Missouri, and some from a quilt shop near Manhattan here. Mom hunted a long time, she said, for the striped fabric for the borders and the sashing. But she finally found it in Joe Morton's collection of fabrics. And Joe Morton has a fabulous collection of reproduction fabrics, Civil War and the 1930s. So this is Leesburg Inn. The next quilt, quilt number 5, is called The Road to Appomattox from 1865, and Mom made it in 2015. This quilt is from a pattern, not a kit, and it commemorates Lee's surrender to Grant on April 9, 1865. Its design gives the illusion of interwoven diagonal roads. Think about how many, many roads had been traveled by the Union soldiers, the Confederate soldiers, husbands, fathers, sons, and even women during that 5-year war. We spent some time 2 years ago in Franklin, Tennessee, a fabulous place. And just the roads to get into Franklin, and I think that was one little tiny spot in the war. It's just amazing. All of those roads led to Appomattox Courthouse. Even though the quilt roads appear diagonal, the simple blocks in the patchwork are set side by side in basic roads. The original pattern was done in navy and pink, and Mom thought it might represent the navy blue of the Union uniforms and the blood that was shed during the war. You see a historic picture of the McLean house there, where the surrender took place, and a present-day picture of the same house. The Appomattox campaign was a series of battles that took place from March 29th to April 9th, 1865, and concluded with the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia to the Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant. You know, Robert E. Lee was a hero to much of the nation. He was first in his class at West Point, which included many of the men he fought with and against. He'd been offered Union leadership positions, but he felt that he had to stay with his people. Mom reminded me that it's his home that is located inside Arlington National Cemetery. Lee did his best, but supplies, soldiers, and luck eventually ran out. The surrender at Appomattox represents the loss of only one of the Confederate field armies, but it was a psychological blow from which the South did not recover. All the remaining Confederate armies would surrender by June 1865. So in my little history brain, I thought that everybody surrendered at Appomattox, but I was looking at that from 2022 perspective, and I realized after Mom reminded me that there wasn't any way to communicate that surrender immediately like we have today. The railroads were gone, the telegraph lines were cut, and it just had to be person to person for the most part. And so they didn't get the news, and a lot of the armies, by the end of June, the rest of the armies had surrendered. In 1977, which is incredible that it was 45 years ago, our family took a summer and toured the eastern part of the United States. And you can do that kind of thing when your parents are both teachers, you know. We joke that we did our country's history backwards because we started at Appomattox, and then we went to where the Civil War started. And then we started at Yorktown, where the Revolutionary War ended, and then we went to Lexington and Concord, where it started. And then we went to Plymouth Rock and Jamestown, so we just did everything totally backwards. But Appomattox sticks in our minds because it was a beautiful, haunting place. 45 years later, we remember our guide. He was a loyal Confederate soldier named John Howard, who would only answer our questions as if it were 1865, which is really cool when you're a teenager. It was moving to hear him describe how it felt to surrender all their guns and begin the long walk home, passing between the rows of Union soldiers, most showing quiet, solemn respect for their fellow men. If you get the chance, Appomattox is a wonderful place to visit. All right, quilt number 6. Our last quilt in the collection. The pattern for this quilt, it's on the table over here, so you need to stand up or you can come by afterwards and look at it. The pattern for this quilt is a really old pattern, but the idea for the quilt came out of Mom's head. And believe me, there's lots of stuff that comes out of Mom's head. And she passed that down too. So, this is called detritus and reconstruction. Now, I don't know about you, but detritus was a totally new word to me. I didn't know what it was. I do now. But it means scraps or ruins or rubbish or garbage. Mom couldn't see just stopping with the Appomattox quilt. We all know that wars don't just end, and unfortunately to this day, there are still lingering conflicts between the two parts of our nation that were once at war. And you know, Mom had all these scraps. Many times, we have leftover scraps, detritus, from a meal, from a tornado, from a war, and you have to clean up the scraps. Mom said, when you have a whole tub of scraps, you put them together and you make a quilt. When the nation is torn apart by war, you put it back together. You clean up the scraps. The Reconstruction was messy. The southern states had to rebuild their lives and property, and they had to work to be readmitted back into the Union. In 1866, they passed a Civil Rights Act, which established military control over the southern states until a new government could be formed. It limited some of the Confederate officials and officers' rights to vote or hold public office, but it gave those rights to former male slaves. That must have gone over really well. Then they passed the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship to the African Americans and protected them from the state laws that discriminated against them. The former Confederate states were not given congressional representation until they adopted that amendment. The 15th Amendment was ratified 2 years later, and it guaranteed African American men the right to vote. The first attempts at Reconstruction were meant to punish the Confederate states. But once those states regained some of their power, they began the game of oppression once again. They changed some of the voting laws and put qualifiers on who was able to vote. These included requirements of owning property, paying toll taxes, and passing literacy or civil exams. Few former slaves could meet those qualifications. It would take another 80 years for our nation to guarantee the right to vote for all of its citizens. Wars leave countries and lives in scraps, and life must be rebuilt. This quilt is made up entirely of scraps from the other 5 quilts. So as we close today, you might be excited that, Lord willing, there will be a quilt 7. It was really cool when Mom told me last week that she's going to make another Civil War quilt. And this one, she's thinking along the lines of the title of When Will We Ever Learn? After our nation's ongoing turmoil and the divisiveness that we seem to be inundated with, it sometimes seems that we haven't learned the lessons that our forefathers fought and died to teach us. Mom is considering the Dresden plate for this quilt, as each plate, this is just a picture, this is not hers, as each plate is made from 20 different pieces. And she intends those 20 pieces in each block to represent 20 different people from all walks of life, from every race, ethnic group, religion, and political party, coming together to create our beautiful United States of America. I brought along one of my Dresden plate variations just to represent quilt number 7. It's kind of tucked on that table. The new quilt will remind us that our strength lies in our love, our compassion, and our unity, regardless of our skin color or our political views. The last slide is a picture of my mom, Jo Hodge, and my granddaughter, her great-granddaughter, Avery Rose Pike. Avery just turned 7, and she is fascinated by the stories of our family, especially those about Grandma Mabel, Mom's mother, who lived just a mile from that Kansas border in the town of Amsterdam, in the area of Missouri, devastated by Order Number 11. Avery's absolute passion, obsession, whatever, is crafts. I think the legacy is going to continue. In closing, thanks, Mom, for all the lessons you've taught us and the wonderful legacy you've left all of us. We love you, and we cherish the memories, and we promise to pass them on. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Let's give her another round of applause. Wouldn't it be so wonderful if all of us knew our background, our history, as well as Karen and her family does? And to have it told through quilts also is fascinating. At this time, I'd like to have Dee Groff come up for just a few minutes. Dee is the owner of Designs down on Leonard Street. It's a quilting shop and crafting shop. She has lots of different little items for sale at different times. And the other day when I was in there talking to her, she reminded me of something very important as far as quilts go. And I'm going to let her share that with you.
All quilts need to be documented. That means having the quilter, the maker, and the date on them. So they can be as simple as just those three things, or you can have many more things on there, such as the information for whom the quilt is made for, the occasion, the maker, the quilter, and the date. But the most important is the maker and the date. Documentation can be written on a scrap of fabric and sewn on the back of a quilt. It can be embroidered on the back, quilted into the quilt. Even special tags have been made for them. And quilt shops sell all sorts of different tags that you can use for documentation. And it's also helpful to adhere your tag to freezer paper. That way it's easier to write on, and so it makes a neater product when you get done. You can find freezer paper at your grocery store. And for historical purposes, quilts need documentation also, because many times the quilts will outlast the quilter by many years. And the later generations, if they don't know the history of that quilt, it doesn't have nearly as much meaning for them. So it can end up in a rummage sale, a thrift store, or even the trash. But when it has the maker's name on it, and they can make a connection to that maker, it becomes more important to them. So documentation is very important on quilts.
Thank you, Dee. How many of you have your quilts 100% documented? Well, I see 3 or 4 or 5 of you. How many of you hadn't thought of that before? How many of you thought of it before, but you just hadn't got it done? That's probably where I'm at. And working at the Onaga Historical Society, we have quilts come in a lot, and people will say, well, I think. Well, that's different than knowing. And to discover the history of a quilt can be kind of challenging. So I challenge all of you, when you go home tonight, to pull out one quilt and document it. It's kind of like writing on the back of photos. How many of you have done that a lot? Of course, now they're in our camera, so it doesn't matter. So documentation is really, really important. At this time, we'd like to have you stretch your legs just a little bit and go to the restroom, get some more refreshments. We have a lot of cookies that have been brought in, and also buy some raffle tickets. So we'll come back again at 3:05. Thank you. Quilter is Margaret Jacobs. And after Margaret Jacobs, she gets to do 3 of them at once. Deb Liggett, be ready to come up. Margaret Jacobs.
I don't have less than a minute because that's just, I got the blocks and embroidered them and put them together because I liked it.
It is beautiful. I love purple.
Yeah, yeah. And it is hand quilted, so.
Did you make it for someone or?
No, I have blocks. I think it covers and holds probably. This one I haven't got quilted yet. They were embroidery blocks and I wanted to do something different. So I appliqued the butterflies and then I embroidered the rest of it. But I've got 3 quilts waiting to be quilted and this is one of them, to be hanged.
Love that.
I can see better from this chair.
I did this a number of years ago. I could sit down and applique a block in the evening, and I just liked the iris, and so I just did it.
That is good.
Any special
I love
fabric
irises.
from where you got?
No,
I like
just
the
fabric
borders
I
in
had picked up. I don't, if there's any special in there, I can't remember it.
There's an iris pattern on the back.
Well, the
They
kids
said what
quilted
her
in,
name
yeah.
was, but it's a beautiful quilt.
Let's give her a round of applause for her. And this one is Debbie Liggett. Okay.
The last one that I've done, I love to do handwork. It's hand embroidered and hand quilted, and this is going to go to a granddaughter one day.
Debbie, where are you from?
Muskota. Yeah.
That's gorgeous. Heard of it?
This is a whole cloth quilt. I opened it up and seen the pattern, you know, because I just bought it in a package, and well, I think I need to applique that. And I tell you, it's not easy. Normally you applique blocks, not a whole quilt.
Yeah.
So it was really hard getting in there. I had to do a lot of prep work and basting and stuff to be able to handle the quilt, but it's hand appliqued, hand quilted too.
How long did it take you to make it?
Well, I worked on the applique for quite a while because I was still working. When I was working and I hand quilted a quilt, it would usually take me a year. I can do them faster now. This one is hand applique, and I had this one machine quilted. I made it before I started hand quilting. Grace Bowser in Holden or Mayette, I'm not sure what her address is, but she quilted it. And this is one of my first quilts. Not the first, but one of them.
Let's give her a round of applause. You know, if you know your next quilt, if you see your quilt coming up, just come up. That'll save me some time.
Okay, I'm Jerry Fowles, and this quilt started out with 12 blocks, this block of the month, when I was quilt block chairman for the Council Prairie Quilt Guild. And then I wanted a bigger quilt, so I designed, there's several blocks in there that I designed, and then there's several that are just regular patterns. And it's both machine quilted and hand quilted, because I got tired of hand quilting. I did. And I found an article in a quilt magazine that said you could do both on a quilt, and I said, hallelujah! Okay.
I'm working on it, sitting here holding mask
I'm Marcia Lobby. I'm Marcia Lobby, and I was inspired to make this quilt by some work that you see a couple of different places. Maybe down here is a nice size chunk. My mom's grandmother, Laura Juno, would use up her scraps that way. And we have different size chunks, members of our family do, and I've made blankets from them. But anyway, I had a lot of frayed dresser scarves and things that were made by people in my family and people that I love. And so it's just it's technically terrible, but it's a hodgepodge of things that mean a lot to me, and I really enjoy doing it.
That reflects a lot of history, doesn't it? Family history.
I do want to throw in that it was hand-tied by Kiana Coker, and she did the knots on the back so that it wouldn't distract from the different pieces and patterns. Kiana Coker, Ann and Bruce, her father, Ann and Bruce Coker's daughter.
She does that.
And then this one is mine as well. I started a long time ago with, I had lots and lots of handkerchiefs from both sides of my family, 5 generations of women in my life. And so I ran across an idea where you could fold the handkerchiefs into these dress patterns. So I could take them off and reuse the handkerchiefs, but I used vintage trim then to trim the dresses, and then Dee Groff quilted it and did such a lovely job.
Does somebody recognize this one? Janet, I'm sorry. Oh.
She was stuck.
You want the microphone or you want to holler? Well, I can talk pretty loud. You want to holler? This is my awash with color quilt. I took a class in Topeka, and it took me 10 years to get done. I didn't start quilting until after Mom passed, several years after Mom passed away, and I was still working. But it was a quilt as you go technique. And so that's why it took me so long. And on the back is what I had to do. Yes, I put a sleeve on it so it could hang it up. I made it as more of a wall quilt. Yeah. And then my quilts are pretty different than everybody else. This is a one-block wonder, and I took the class in label on the back.
Eudora.
Yeah, I took the class in Eudora, and it says when I started it and when I finished it. I took the class in 2016, and then I didn't say when I finished it. I thought I did. Oh yeah, 2020. And I quilted this by myself on my sewing machine. And it's all one fabric. There's on the back is a sample of what the fabric looked like. But it's the way you cut it and you sew it by rows. So that's the same fabric, except for the boards. And this is it's called the stack and whack. And I took a class for that, and I was just starting, so I didn't know what I was doing. I took it in 2008, about the time I bought my Bernina, and a gal in our quilt guild actually taught the class.
and I finished it in 2017. And this is all one fabric, but it's the way you cut this is actually the fabric. And it's the way you lay it and cut it, and it's called a stack and wax. And I have to say, all of my quilts have labels on. And I usually have something in mind when I make my quilts. So I have taken pictures of all my quilts. And my sister, Marge, gave me a journal. And so I bought a photograph book, and I put the pictures in the sleeve of the book. And then in the journal, I number them. And so I write about what I was thinking or what I did or what happened when I made the quilt, so that they'll have the journal and the pictures. Because the majority of my quilts I make for family members or I've given them away. So.
And Janet?
Debbie said, bring your apron. So I asked her, well, what are we doing with our aprons? And she said, well, wear it when you did. And so this was an apron. I found the pattern, and it reminded me of the aprons that Grandma Bossy used to wear. And so I made it, and then I had a children's pattern with it. So I made my granddaughter one out of the same fabric. And I made all three of my granddaughters out of this pattern. So they had an apron.
Thank you, Janet.
Okay, no, that's okay. This quilt actually kind of started out as a joke. When I married into the Coker family and moved out to the house where I live now, Bruce had gingham multicolored shirt in the closet and red gingham curtains in the master bedroom and blue gingham curtains in the office, and I got rid of all of those things. And for the next 25 years, all I could hear about was all of this wonderful gingham that I had gotten rid of. So I made this quilt for Bruce for our 25th wedding anniversary. So there you go. I will add on to that one, Dee Groff actually did the quilting on that one. This one is also mine. It's called the ribbon quilt. It was a real easy block to make, but it was the first block that I'd ever made that was on point. That was kind of the reason why I wanted to try it. It was also the first quilt that I did the whole thing. I just did the tying on it, and I really liked this little piece on the edge. It was just an extra challenge to do.
Isn't it fun the different things that quilts mean to different people and why they are made and what people are thinking when they make the quilt?
This is Addie's. This is mine.
I took a Bargello class, and so I wanted to make something bright and colorful for my daughter's birthday. That little girl over there. And so that would have been, I think, probably 2019. And my mom quilted it, Dee Groff quilted it, and I did all the other stuff on it. It's got the matching colorful feathers on the back.
There's another one on the table, right, that you did also?
Yes, I did. There's like a blue and purple one on the table back there.
How many of you have done that technique before? Someone want to finish mine? It's been sitting there, what, 2 years, 3 years, Dee?
Oh, okay, close. This is another stack and whack. I'm going to explain stack and whack a little bit. This fabric is what I bought. It jumped off the shelf into my arms. I didn't have a choice. But if you look for this butterfly, somewhere there will be a block that has, every piece has this butterfly. Because I put all the butterflies on top of each other and then I cut the pieces out. This is hand quilted with black thread. And I think I did it in 2018, but I don't remember. And I probably didn't document it.
I think she'll go home tonight and document that quilt, right?
This is my pride and joy, thank you, magnum opus, biggest deal in my life. I started this in 2009, I was gonna make one block, if I didn't like it, I was gonna quit. I made one block and I liked it, and then I made another block. This was in my go bag, everywhere I went I'd take a go bag. And I started in 2009, and the pattern book says things like mom's knee surgery, dad's operation. And it is all hand-pieced, needle turn applique, which means I cut out every little piece and turn the edge under and stitch it on. And it is hand quilted a ½ inch apart. I expected this to take 2 years to quilt. But thanks to COVID and retirement, I had it done in 6 months.
You know, and she can still see. If I work that long on little bitty stuff, I can't see. Beautiful.
This is another stack and whack. Sue's taught, I don't know how many stack and whack classes at my shop. Anyway, this is a stack and whack sampler. And like she said before, the focus fabric is all the same. It's all the same fabric. It's just cutting them in those stacks that makes your different designs.
I took a stack and whack class. How many of you have done a stack and whack? You know, until I actually took the class, I couldn't envision how this would work. But it's a neat technique.
We went to Alaska for a trip, and the Alaska fabric I bought in Skagway and Anchorage, and the ones we got in Anchorage, Roger actually picked out because he wanted me to make him a lap quilt. Well, it ended up a memory quilt, and this hangs behind our bed. But he got his lap quilt, and I also made another quilt out of those pieces for my sister and brother-in-law that went with us. So it's got hand embroidery, machine embroidery, applique. It has lots of different techniques.
Want to show them the back? Yeah.
Isn't that beautiful?
Okay, I'm Nancy Hubbard, and I wanted to learn something outside of the box. So I downloaded pictures, had them printed, and then enlarged them sometimes, and painted them with these markers, fabric markers. And I wanted to try to embellish them, so I embroidered then on top of all of them. Then it is hand quilted 1 inch apart, and I thought, okay, this isn't big enough. It's not going to fit on the bed. So it's my UFO, and I haven't finished it, and I'm trying to figure out if I want to put the hang on the edge of the bed to be like a picket fence to go with the flower, but I ain't got that far. So someday I'll get it done, and if I add this to it, then I have to keep quilting, you know, and figure out how to finish it. But UFO.
How many of you have heard that term before, UFO?
Oh.
Okay, how many of you have some of those? Bring them back next year. This is my quilt, and I'm almost embarrassed because I'm just a beginning quilter, really. And I like, Dee Groff knows I like little squares. Little pieces of fabric drive me nuts. But this particular quilt is made out of all the scraps from my mother-in-law, Leona Burgess. And that's the meaning to this quilt for me. I'm scared to wash it. I don't know what color it will turn when I wash it, but anyhow, those are her scraps. Oh, the edge, well, I think they're called prairie points, is that? Yeah. I'm not an expert on quilting here. Leona put a lot of prairie points on her quilts when she made them, and I kind of like the design of it, but gosh, it takes forever to fold those little things and sew them on. And I was getting ready to bring it the other night, and I thought, oh my gosh, how many of you finished a quilt and then found you didn't catch something quite right, and it's sticking out? And I thought, oh, all these experts here, I got to get that poked back in. So I did. This is also a quilt I brought, and I brought it for a special reason. My Aunt Jeannie Northup, some of you will know Jeannie Northup, embroidered it and put it together, and it's I'm not sure how she did this on the back, but anyhow, my sister bought it for her daughter when her daughter got married. And over the time, there's some stains on it, and I'm hoping someone here can help me with those, because I've tried to get them out, and when I wash it, they go away, and then a month later, they're back. So I don't know what that is, other than a ghost. The reason I brought that is because I think it's beautiful. But how many of you know young people that get tired of something and throw it away? Well, my niece was tired of this and put it in the trash. And my sister happened to be there and took it out of the trash and said, here, Deb, you can sell it at the rummage sale for the Historical Society. Well, I'm not going to sell it. But I bring it just to point out that things we value, we need to teach the younger generation to value. But how many of you have already seen things thrown away that you just cringe, because there is a history to it. And when I think of the hours that are going into these quilts just to be thrown in a trash can, but it's happening. So that was on the bottom of the stack because I wanted to point out somehow we need to pass on the need to treasure things. Now we go to our next group of quilts.
Okay, this quilt was made by my Grandma Marie Ballantyne, and she made it when she was about 87 years old. I know that it's called I guess a nine patch quilt. That's about all I know about quilting. I wish I knew how to do it, but she worked on it with her trundle sewing machine, and I also did, I believe, some hand stitching in it too. And on the corner, one of these corners, it's documented that it's to Lisa, made by Grandma Marie, I think, something like that.
Looks like it.
Yeah, and the year that she made it, which was 92?
Yeah.
By Grandma Marie. And I really like how she, 92, I really like how she documented that for me. It means a lot to me, and it's something that I will treasure always, and probably pass down to my daughter, and tell her the history of it, and keep it forever. And I keep it in a safe place so the pets don't get to it, and I just love it, and I think this is a wonderful thing to do, to pass down to future generations.
Thank you.
This is actually the very first quilt that I made. I guess I can call it the decade quilt. I can call it the 3-generation quilt. I got the bright idea that I wanted to make a quilt with my mom, and got a quilt book out, and this was the one that I decided we were going to pick. This was long before I knew of anything about half-square triangles, so I actually cut out the diamond shapes, and then pretty soon we figured out that it was going to be really hard to put the corners and the triangles in, and that's when my mom stepped in. I was doing all my part on the sewing machine, but she hand-stitched all the corners and the triangles in. And then my children, by that point in time, had come along. They actually designed where each block was going to go in the quilt. And then it was quilted by Dee Groff here in town. I also finished it with the prairie points, and I would say, like you, Debbie, oh my gosh. I might try that again someday, but that was a challenge.
How many of you worked on a quilt with with a daughter or a granddaughter? Or I had one man that I thought was going to come and show quilts today, and he didn't show up. We need to teach these skills to our young men also.
This one's mine as well. My grandmother made me this one. She actually made all the granddaughters, ones just like this, one year for Christmas. All of the little girls, those were made out of my dresses that she made me when I was a kid. So it's really special. And I'll just read the documentation because her documentation is always really good. To Adia Groff, this quilt is made from scraps from some of your first dresses that I made for you. Ada Pritchard. Yeah, this one's also by my grandma. I'm looking for the documentation. Oh, there it is. Okay, and I'm just going to read the documentation on this one because it's made from vintage ties. Made by Ada Pritchard, started in '96, finished in January '97. Used 65 to 70 neckties and quilts, and then it says, wash in warm water.
I think we forgot to give everybody a round of applause, so we'll catch up on a round of applause here.
My name is Jolene Cervantes, and this was made by my mother, Lenora Teskey. And in 1981, I did find a book recently where she had written all the quilts down, so I will go through and document. But she probably embroidered all the squares, and probably it's hand quilted, probably by the Needlecraft Club, which was South Onaga, a group of old ladies. And she made this for me, and it's queen size. So at first she used scraps, but she started to buy material just to make the size. So
I'm just trying to get it so we can halfway. Yeah, it's really
Oh, and I have gone through things. I'm not throwing them away, but I found, and I have back there a quilt probably that was done by my great-grandmother and my great-aunt, not pieced together, but probably fabric of 100 years. And then I found another one that probably was the last one my mother worked on, which was machine. It's the top. And I'm donating that to the Historical Society for an auction at some time. It needs to be finished as a project, but it's setting back over there too.
You'll have to take a minute to look at those. Jolene, I'm going to give a little kudo to Jolene right now. She does most of our military documentation at the museum on all of our Civil War veterans especially, and World War I and some World War II. So she's always on the computer finding that information for it. It's valuable.
Debbie late at night sends me, here's another name.
So about 2 in the morning, she's probably hearing bing, bing, and she's, oh no, not another one. But she's been great with that, and we thank you for bringing your quilts.
Thank you.
This top was finished by my mother-in-law, and she died very suddenly in 1987 on her 85th birthday. And after she passed away and we were going through things in the house, we came across 2 of these tops, just like this. One had Gail's name on it and one had Carol's name on it. So I took it down. There are 2 of these, and I took them to the senior center and had the ladies down there quilt them. And then I went ahead and bound it, and so now they haven't gotten them yet. But they will soon. But they are not documented yet, and it should be, I need to get a couple of those blocks and put that on the back. But I had seen these pieces lying about, when Grandma was working on it, but never did see the whole thing. And so I was, when you find them after that, you weep a little, and then you take charge and you get it done for her. Thank you.
Isn't that a happy looking quilt? Like colors and everything.
I'm a scrappy quilter, and I have scraps. And my daughter was in the Make It With Wool contest for many, many years, and so I have all these scraps of wool. And this is a wool, flannel, and then I hand appliqued flannel flowers on and embroidered around the edge. Well, I'm a hand quilter, but I didn't want to do tiny hand quilting through my wool. So I tried another out-of-the-box idea. It's called Big Stitch. And I have a whole supply of linen thread left over from who knows where. And so it is big stitched with linen thread. And you'll note there's no bindings. The wool glues to the back and goes over the backing, which is a warm, fleecy type fabric. But you don't have to necessarily cut and sew a binding onto everything.
Thank you, Nancy.
This is my quilt, actually, and it was given to Tim and I for our wedding, and it was created by Aunt Ruth. And Nancy, stand up. She's an only child of Ruth's, and so it's kind of special that we got a quilt from her. From what I understand, I think some of this is some of the kids' different dresses, because the kids from the Rogan camps, Joe and Betty, she said that Betty would give a lot of the material to Ruth, and then Ruth would create it. So I feel like it's a real good heirloom fan quilt, all hand done, that she had done. So anyway, thanks for coming to see it. This is also an heirloom in a sense. My mother quilted at least, I'm going to say 30 to 40 quilts, and this one was done by Edna Steinmuggy, my mother, and she did cross stitch and other things. We've got one on the next one that has some applique, but that's about, I know she probably did this in the 90s, maybe, yeah, it would have to be in the 90s. So, and at that time she still was using our old sewing machine and figured out the border, but she didn't want to put anything between each block. So anyway, thank you.
Think of the hours on that cross stitching, goodness.
I am not a quilter, I'm a crafter, but I have a lot of respect for my relatives that are. This came from Lavona Biesenthal. I went and picked it up from her. She shared the story of her and her mother, Meta Figgy, quilting this together, the little 1-inch squares, and working on this when she was much younger. So again, I don't have a lot of those cousins left of her age, and so I just wanted to share that with you guys today.
For those of you that live around here, maybe those of you that don't, we're hearing a lot of genealogy today, aren't we?
Hi, I'm Robin Coulterman, and this quilt was begun by my mother, Betty Bernritter, in 1960, the year before I was born, and she didn't finish it. So when my first daughter was born in 1990, I finished it. And it is embroidered and machine appliqued, machine appliqued and embroidered. And it is documented down here in the very little the corner as our initials and our years, when it was started and when it ended. And this quilt was made by my mother-in-law, Lorena Coulterman, in 1988 when my husband Dan and I got married. She made this from scraps from some of my scraps and some from her daughters. So not only does the quilt have a story, but each block has a story. Like this was a favorite sundress of mine, and there's like my sister-in-law's prom dress is in there, and other people, have similar stories that the quilts, each piece meant something. She pieced this and hand quilted it. And when she gave it to me in 1988, I looked at it and I said, I'm not taking it. Yeah, why? She did not document on the back her name. I said, you put your name on it, and where is it?
It's over there in the corner.
In this corner. And she couldn't believe that I wanted. She said, why would you document a quilt? It's just for use. This is made by Lorena Coulterman for Dan and Robin, 1990. It was 93 when she finally finished it, I guess.
As we look at all these quilts and everything, we have a lot of heirlooms here, don't we? This little rabbit was thrown away. Well, it was given to, probably 20 years ago. I was involved with Big Brothers Big Sisters, and to raise money, we would have a stuffed animal toss game at the fair. Well, this little rabbit came in to go out in the stuffed animal toss game, and I fell in love with this little rabbit. And you can tell he's well worn. But it's an idea for some old quilts and things that maybe you want to put together something like this rabbit. Now, he is loved by my grandchildren, and I don't know about your grandchildren, but they love magic markers. So he has been branded for our house. Tattooed, he was tattooed. Now we're moving into some of our older quilts. We're turning back time, and I think the decades here is going to be
1940s and older. Well, you have to ask her what it was.
I'm forgetting what it is.
Okay. All righty. I do not know exactly when this quilt was made, but the original of this quilt is in the Smithsonian. It was made by a lady who was a former slave named Harriet Powers, and she was born in 1846 and died, if I remember right, in 1910. As you can see, here's Abel's slewing cane. This is the crucifixion. This is the naming of the animals. Each square has a distinct meaning. Now, what happened is they took this quilt and outsourced to have copies of it made or reproductions, I think in China. And the International Quilt Guild went ballistic. So they basically destroyed everything that hadn't been sold. There's one other of these in the state of Kansas, and a lady at the Kansas Historical Society owns it, because I took it there with Barb, that you were talking about, Barb Baxterman, called her and said, who can I get to authenticate this or tell me about it? So she gave me this lady's name. And the other one, I intended to bring a picture of it, and I walked off and left all of it on the computer. So I'm sorry about that. But I bought this at an auction in Atchison, Kansas, and I paid $500 for it, and I never told my husband. I wouldn't like to sleep outside.
Linda and Addie, can you show the top motifs? Yeah, just the top. You saw the bottom, if we can see the top.
And just saying, it's really heavy.
Wow.
It's like really heavy.
What a wonderful story. Thank you. Now, you know, if your husband doesn't know this, we will be putting this on YouTube. Oh, okay.
He's not going to, he's safe from knowing.
We don't know that for sure.
I do want to make one comment about documenting. My mother has a beautiful, beautiful stack and white quilt that my aunt made her, and it's hand quilted, teeny tiny. And she's in a nursing home. And they wrote her name on that top of that quilt with a black magic marker. That is not the way to document your quilts. We were sick. This is actually my first quilt. I was 7. I know this because Grandma documented it, and it says P 1960, Q 1962. It has been well used and well loved. I was not allowed to have it till I got married. Grandma had a treadle sewing machine, and when I was about 5, she started teaching me how to sew. She'd hold me on her lap, and she'd treadle, and I would run the stuff through. And later on, I'm pretty sure that I probably pieced a lot of this. But now that I'm a quiller, I know that Grandma did a lot more than I did. This pattern is called Jack in the Pulpit. I don't know if she knew I was going to marry a preacher, but I thought it was kind of cool. Also, I never saw Grandma make another quilt with just 2 colors. All of her quilts, and she made hundreds of, I mean lots and lots of quilts. All of them were scraps, except this one.
This is what's neat. You know, sometimes our quilts, you know, we have worn spots, and those are kind of wisdom spots. And this shows the wisdom of the decades. It was loved. This quilt was hand-pieced by my great-grandmother in about, we think, 1941, or around that time sometime. And it sat in a cedar chest for decades. And after I got my job up here, I found a hand quilter named Letha Bateman that lived in Havensville, and she hand quilted it for me. And then my mother, Ada Pritchard, went ahead and did the binding and finished it all up. So it was started in 1941 and was finished in 1986, I think. And Mother documented in the corner. By embroidering. And so this is a very special quilt to me. I never knew my great-grandmother. My grandmother never sewed, but my mom and great-grandma did that. So it's a real special one. You know what's neat is it survived for over 40 years to be finished and now loved in the end.
I'm originally from Heston, Kansas, and my mother was a sewer, and I was a 4-H sewer. And growing up in the 50s, the 60s, I remember her making the butterflies. And I know that some of the fabric is left over from what she made for us. She also, in a satin stitch, embroidered all the bodies. You can see some are, you know, coming apart there. And so when I was going through the stack of stuff when we emptied their house out, she died, I found these butterflies and I thought, okay. I pieced them together with fabric I found in her stash, and I hand quilted all around them. Just a wide binding, and then I still had some left over, gave them to my sister. The wings had never been cut out. My sister cut them out. She took black fabric and re-sewed the bodies and hand embroidered the antenna. And she just finished that hand stitching about 2 weeks ago. So last weekend I was there. We documented it all on the computer, printed it out on a piece of fabric, sewed it to the back of her quilt. And so we have 2 quilts made from Mom's butterflies.
You see the documentation?
No, it's on the other quilt.
It'll get there.
Okay.
How neat.
That's a pretty one.
This was given to us when my husband and I got married in '73. His grandmother quilted a quilt this size for each grandchild, and I think I came up with 12. I think there were 12 of us. Good Lord. And each grandchild got it after they got married. She also made one baby quilt for each great-grandchild. Just one family got one quilt, that was all. And I was told this was the wedding ring pattern, but to me it looks more like a drop of water in a pond.
It's a drunkard's pattern.
Drunkard's pattern? Okay, I wasn't sure that. I thought the wedding ring was a different pattern, but that's what they told me this was. She quilted all these probably in the 50s and 60s. I think she died in around 1985.
Thank you. When I look at this, I think, how did she keep track of all those little squares of fabric and get them in the right place? This is another one of my quilts. This is my husband's, belongs to Eugene Burgess. His grandma, Effie Colderman Burgess, so we're into genealogy again, quilted this for him, and she did document Eugene. She gave it to Eugene December of 1961. So that's kind of special for us. She would have made that, well, I'm not sure when she would have made that, before 61. I was hoping I could talk Eugene to come in and show it. But you know, how many of you have heifers that are calving right now? That was his excuse.
Okay, this is the state bird quilt. This is my mom's. This is what I remember growing up on the bed all the time. I'm not sure of the year. There's only 48 states, so I'm guessing early 60s then for this. And I don't know, Sue, if you can, I know Sue quilted a lot for Mom, so I don't know for sure who it was quilted by, but I just remember Mom was always embroidering, and she made a lot of quilts, but this is the one that I remember growing up. This is actually my mom's quilting, Edna Steinlage, and I want to show both the pillow and the quilt. The embroidery that is on it was one of the first things I can kind of remember she showing me, and we did tea towels. But then she gave me some of these to do, and I always liked purple and lilacs, and you know how you are as a, well, that started off in probably junior high maybe. well, went into high school. You gotta get this done before we go to college. So I ended up, so I put 70s on it because I did the embroidery. She was waiting on me on a lot of it. She went ahead and appliqued all of the little flowers and everything on it and did the quilting itself by hand. And then well, I guess she even did the border by hand, it looks like to me. Our sewing machine wasn't the best. And then on the quilt, or on the pillow, I just brought that because they said they needed some pillowcases. So I grabbed this one, but it means something to me. This is embroidery that was done by my mother, but the hand embroidery around it was done by my grandmother, and that's a Steinlage. And so Edna Steinlage, or Boding, Ed Boding, Steinlage, and myself. And then I have this for my own memories. So that's part of it all.
You know, when these registrations were coming in, it was kind of hard to know exactly where to put them because so many started like in 1950 and finished in 2010. So, you know, where do they really go? We ended up pretty much going with when they were started, when the top was done.
This one was made by my mother, my sister, and I when I was young. We were snowed in, so how do you entertain two girls? And so a quilt frame was set up in the living room, and my dad walked around it with great interpretation, I should say, or maybe he swore at it more than anything else. But this is how we spent our snowed-in winter. And back in the 50s, we were snowed in for weeks where I lived. And of course, these were like my brother's shirt. I remember, you know, it's just fabric from clothes we made. This one is a friendship quilt, and this one was given to my sister. And it has special meaning to me because right here in the center is my grandmother's signature. And my whole life she was blind, so I never got to see her signature. So this is very special. It also has all of my mother's sisters' signatures on it. So there's like the 5 Baker girls. And also, at the very top is May Shane. I don't know how many of you remember the Shanes, but I was named for May Shane. So that's real special for me.
Another neat thing about this quilt is May said, you want to tell them?
When the Historical Society comes to Havensville Living History Days, and they brought this quilt to one of the days, and I was so excited because it had May Shane's signature on it. I was just like elated, and I took all these pictures. So it's very interesting to see all these ladies that you grew up and talk about documenting. They have done a great job of documenting who the people are. And that's real interesting because some of these people, I didn't know who they were. And that really helped kind of figure out where they tied in to the family. So, yeah, thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, May. How many of you have looked at friendship quilts and see some of the same names going through different quilts? We have, I think I mentioned, we have 11 friendship quilts at our museum, made by different groups. And what we've tried to do, maybe some of you looked at this, we tried to put together a 3-ring binder that lists the friendship quilts. And then we went in and we typed out the names, and then through a variety of us have tried to figure out who they were and what their lifespan was, and if they were connected to anyone else. And many times it will be a family type quilt or a neighborhood type quilt. And of course in neighborhoods, they tended to marry the next door neighbor. So you get a lot of genealogy in putting together this. So I would encourage all of you to come back to our museum in the summer. We're not open in the winter. And take some time with our quilts. And maybe we'll draft you into helping us turn these things, because I understand we should refold them and take some of them down.
Okay, over the years, and as when Jolene brought her quilt out and talked about the quilting group, I remember Grandma Fairbanks always had a quilt on the frame in the dining room, and I think that one might have been one of them, I'm not real sure. And then carried on then was Aunt Sadie Martin, and she made numbers of quilts. She always had them entered at the fair. She would probably enter them repeatedly at the fair. So when she passed, her quilts were out for everyone to pick. The nieces, the sisters, the sister-in-laws got to pick quilts. And so this quilt came to our home. Aunt Sadie did a wonderful job of documenting every quilt that she did. This quilt was a beloved heirloom, blocks of the 1900s by Mary Grossnickel, Violet Grossnickel, Sadie Clark, pieced and quilted by Sadie Martin in 1991. And there's many more of hers around.
You know, when you get ready to do something with your quilts, if you don't think your family is going to appreciate them, or if they have particular connections to communities, think about donating them to your local museum. We appreciate getting quilts up here whenever they come in that add to our history here.
These two.
Is that even on? Yes. This was a quilt that we got when my husband's Aunt Marie Butler passed, and they had a sale at her house. This is a utilitarian quilt. It was used, it's made out of probably coats, pants. It's not very large because we didn't have big beds in those days. It's heavy as all get out. Probably it's coming apart in places, but they never wasted anything. This was probably from back, you know, like in the 30s. The fabric looks like about that era. And they didn't have anything. Poor folks have poor ways. You use what you had. So, and this is an example of how quilting actually started, why it was necessary, and then how they, just because it had to be useful and you used old stuff did not mean it did not deserve a pattern and did not deserve some style to it, and some creativity and some beauty, even though it's kind of, you know, men's pants are only so much. And old coats, you know, this might have been ladies' coats and grandpa's, great-grandpa's pants. But it was probably worn, but it was never used too much because it's in good shape. Most of these quilts like this didn't survive.
What's on the back? What's on the back?
Just a fabric, yes.
Oh, that reminds me of Mom and Dad.
Yeah.
Very soft.
Yeah. But the fact that it actually survived all those years, and they maybe they made it and then they got new blankets and didn't have to use the old ones. But they put it away and they kept it. So now it's in my house.
What a neat thing to have.
Hi, I'm April Darnell. I live in Wamego. This quilt, this one that's the original, my sister who lives in Indiana bought this at a rummage sale, and like a lot of people do, she put it in the washing machine, and she said, I bought this old quilt, but a lot of the fabric came apart when I washed it. So I looked at it, and I realized this is Civil War era quilt. It has double pink fabric. Some of the dyes that were used at that time are caustic or were caustic, and they would eat away at the fabric over time. So when you wash them, they end up in a blob in the bottom of your washing machine. It's hand quilted. It looks like it has either muslin or a like grain sack type fabric on the back.
but it's very nicely hand quilted. So I copied it. I measured the blocks, and I got reproduction fabrics from my collection, and used the similar double pink for the setting strips. It's a strippy design, and I made one for her, and I made one for me. And I quilted mine on my long arm. I didn't sit and reproduce the hand quilting that's on this one. So this is kind of a cautionary tale. If you have an old quilt and you don't know if it's going to hold up or not, don't wash it. And especially don't wash it in the washing machine.
Wow, what a nice then and now. Oh, look at the back of that one too. Very nice, thank you. And now we have...
Are we going to do this one the last one? Well, I don't know what that...
Yeah, that's May's.
Oh, we need to do that.
Yeah, we need to do that.
I thought that was part of the Civil War. This is our oldest quilt here today.
I was cleaning out my mom and dad's house, getting it ready for renters, and I went to Grandma Wagner's closet and found this quilt. And according to Marla Day from K-State, I knew it had to be like 1800s, and she said, yes, this is probably from around 1870. And it's a utility quilt, thank you, Karen, made of, like you say, coats, pants, anything that they had. So I do remember it laying on Grandma Wagner's bed. So other than that, it's all hand sewn, and it is very heavy, and it has like a flannel back. And I asked Marla Day from K-State if I could clean it and she said, no, that's life's patina on that. You leave that alone.
Thank you, May. I guess I'd never heard that before. Had all of you life's patina on it? We've had some questions about how to clean and how to wash old quilts, and I don't have the answers, but if you enjoyed today, put your hand up. When we were planning this, we thought, oh my gosh, next year we'll have to have it be a day workshop. And it was suggested maybe we try to find a speaker that could talk to us a little bit about cleaning and preserving quilts. So I want to thank all of you quilters. I hope you've shared a little bit of your history with us, but I hope you gained more yourself in being able to share the quilts. You know, things we keep in our cedar chest, nobody can really enjoy. Not even the children we want to pass them on to. If they never see us using it, how can they love it? And I brought in some of my mother-in-law's china today for the tea, and somebody says, well, what if something gets broke? And I says, well, that's okay. That's less for my kids to have to throw away when I die. So we need to use some of these things. Ruth, did you have a...
Well, I lived in an older neighborhood, and there were two ladies, one that lived behind me and one lived next door to me. And they told me that to get stains off your quilts, this was their suggestion, and I don't know, I never tried it, but you lay it out on a winter day in the snow, a sunshiny winter day, and spray water on the stain and let it dry, and then if it doesn't go away, you keep doing that until it goes away. Now, I don't know if that works, but it has to be on snow.
That's what they used to do
Anybody
in
ever
Ireland.
heard of that?
They had drying fields in Ireland where they put the linen out. That's how it bleached the...
Who's going to volunteer to try that? Drew.
It sounds like what they did where they grew flax, like in Ireland, they had drying fields, and they would put the linen out made from the flax, and they would let the sun bleach it. If If it's not done that way, it's kind of a yellowish color, it's maize color that gets white as you leave it out in the sun. So she's probably correct. There you go. And since you called on me, can I ask a question real quick? I did not see a quilt here today that's like one I've got at home. My husband brought home from an auction in the bottom of a box. And he knows I love trees, and it's a tree. It's absolutely gorgeous, but it's very old, and the leaves, there must be a million leaves on this thing. The leaves are kind of coming off, but I'd like to be able to identify the pattern and to find out how to fix it. Okay.
We do have all these books over here that Linda Tessendorf put together with patterns, and it might be in there.
So can we come to the museum to look?
Oh, yes, that would be fine, yeah. Any other questions or comments? May?
When I talked to Marla Day, she had a suggestion because of the quilt. She said, when you have a family gathering, she said, bring that quilt out and tell the next generation the story about the quilt, how your mother made it for you, or however. At every family gathering, do that so the next generation will appreciate what has gone into these quilts. And do it at the family gatherings and kind of tell the stories that go with these quilts. Like we've shared them today. And do that at each kind of, I don't know if you have an annual, we have one at Easter every year. And I thought, what a great idea to bring out these quilts that our family has enjoyed, because I know my sons have no clue what went into them or who made them or who these people are, but kind of tell that lineage down so that they will know. And that was from Marla Day.
I can verify that. When my mother-in-law turned 90, we had a big birthday party for her at the large Methodist church in Horton, Kansas. And everybody brought in quilts that she had made. She made lots of quilts. And that she had either made or worked on, and the pews were all just covered with her lovely quilts.
The quilts that had signatures of people on them, several years ago, we lived at Dover at one time, and one of the people there, his mother had died when he was about a year and a half old, and he did not remember his mother at all. But there was a quilt that came up. It had been quilted by a lady in the community for sale for the fire department fundraiser. His mother's signature was on that quilt. And I had told my husband, you know, when you go, because I was someplace else, if you go, I said, I paid $250 for that quilt. The quilt bought $3,500 because that man was going to have his mother's signature come heck or high water. Wow. So you don't know how important those things are to some people.
How many of you noticed it's not cheap to make these quilts, is it? And they truly are works of art. And I think we are all, not just quilters, we are artists. And we need to think of it that way. I saw a hand, Jeannie?
Well, Lisa's grandmother died in '96, and I remember after I called the girls, and there was a third granddaughter, to tell about the death, they told me later each one of them went to where that quilt was and that they had and picked it up and hugged it. And when the granddaughter came up from Alabama to her grandmother's funeral, she was handed the quilt and she hugged it right away. Those quilts meant so much to those three girls.
One lady, well, she's a Flynn, has taken some quilts that are kind of torn and tattered and have bad spots in them and cut them up into doll blankets for her grandchildren. And if, Barb, you want to hold up that framed piece? This is one example she sent to me, and this is an example of a quilt that was the batting, the middle layer of the quilt is another old quilt. And so it's a quilt on top of a quilt. And she sent that to the museum for us to be able to put that on display so people could kind of be aware of that. You know, next year, talk about dragging these quilts out and telling a story, each of you need to bring a granddaughter with you and focus on our children and our grandchildren. Every year at the fair, how many of you have entered a quilt? Well, several. You know, I found out that if you enter a quilt in the fair, don't enter it because you want to win a prize. The first year I entered a quilt, I don't know when I've been so humbled in my life. But it's more to display, just like today, it was a display, it was a learning experience, it was a sharing experience, and that's really what the quilts are, it should be at the fair, a learning and a sharing experience. So Nancy, you want to talk about that a minute?
I'm superintendent at the county fair for textiles, okay? We normally have 40 to 50 quilts, biggest in any of the counties anywhere around, okay? And my purpose is that it needs to be share your inspiration and your creativity, okay? If you have finished a quilt within the last couple of years, enter it August the 4th. By noon. If you can't get there by noon on August the 4th, call me, I'll pick it up, I'll get your information, I'll enter it for you. Starting at 1 o'clock, the judges have to think out loud. So you can sit in the audience and listen to that judge while they judge the quilts. And she won't be done before 4 o'clock or 4:30. Or the second judge to do crochet, knitting, textiles, embroidery, all other textiles. Okay, I never have the same judge year after year, so you get a different opinion every year. Okay? Please enter. And if you have a story about it, such as, Grandma started this, but I had to do the quilting, I had to do the piecing, I had to do the... Put it on a card, we'll attach it so that the audience that comes through for the next 3 days can read about your story. Also, we have individual, you did 100% of the work, or group quilts. You pieced it, but you paid somebody to quilt it, then you are judged as a group, okay? 3 divisions, hand quilted, sewing machine quilted, long arm quilted. And every class is the same under that. Applique, embroidered, pieced, And then there's a 4th division for clothing or purses or home decor or whatever else you want to bring as a creative idea. We have hundreds of people that go through it and they go, oh, look at that. Oh, I could try that. You know, from simple little squares to beautiful embroidery or applique. Share your creativity and inspire others.
Thank you, Nancy. How many of you have been to our Potawatomi County Fair to see the quilt displays things? It's always fun to go in and see the inspirations. Well, I can't believe we actually did that and we're on time. and those of you that know me know that's pretty good. Let me get my little notes over here. While we're bringing up the slips of paper for the door prizes, I want to make sure that everybody has signed in. If you didn't sign the black book, hold up your hand so you can be in the door prizes. Crafting for Others back there shows a couple of the lap quilts that we put together to give out to veterans. And then we have a quilt of valor that Nancy Hubbard brought through her quilting, valor quilting.
Onaga Quilt of Valor group. And you're welcome to please, there's an entry form there if you want to join. It's $15 a year, and we provide a lot of the fabric and patterns for you to take home, work on, bring back. Please join us. The info's over there, or come see me.
I was pleased to be able to join a presentation of the Quilt of Valor this past year to Dale Colderman, and it's an extremely moving experience. I want to thank Rosie Bossi for coming in with all of her books, and if you haven't read any of them, you need to stop by, and she'll autograph, if you buy it, she'll autograph it. We thank her for coming in for that. Once again, I want to thank Karen Wagner for her presentation on the Civil War. And isn't it interesting how some of our stuff fed right into that presentation today? Okay. Okay, we have, these door prizes have been